it is a truism around the world, in every country, that the future of the world economy depends above all on technological progress as we go from, for example, fossil fuels to electric automobiles, as we go from one kind of transportation to another, from one kind of medical care to a more advanced, more capable medical care. We need trained, educated people. That will determine the future of the American economy much more than where the location of our next factory is, whether it's in Mexico or the United States. It is silly to be focused, for example, on moving factories, a difficult, risky, long-term project, while we get rid of our educational institutions. And make no mistake, what you're watching on the federal level is similar to what is happening in many of the states of the United States. The White House, when celebrating the Supreme Court's decision, said it wants to give the power of education to the states. Yeah, but the states don't have the resources the federal government does. The states are focused, logically, on the state. But the state's objectives are different from that of the federal government. That's why we have a federal government. That's why every other country has. And while I'm talking about other countries, let me drive home the point, not that it should be needed, but in the People's Republic of China, they are spending more each year on education, not less. They are building schools and building colleges left and right. You know, until a few decades ago, basically until World War II, we had a level of higher education that was split between public and private. Private were most of the colleges and universities. Public were what we called land-grant institutions. They were colleges and universities basically to set up to help farmers, to help the rural agricultural people with important training of farmers and helping farmers understand fertilizer and chemistry and all the rest of it. Only after World War II did the American working class make a fundamental demand on this society.
Hello brothers and sisters, welcome back to the channel. Well, I'm hoping that you're doing great from wherever you're watching me from. As you know, I'm your host and presenter Stories, and today is a good day for us to have this great discussion. Now, Richard DeWolf is an American economist. He's a professor who generally essentials his talk about things that are happening in the United States. And I think you're not hearing this word for the first time. Yeah, actually the person who was behind the prediction of the decline of an empire. That's Richard DeWolf. He has talked, he has written, and he has hosted different speeches, different talks about all these things. And in today's video, he's going to be talking about why the US getting down education will lead to its downfall. I want to switch this video. It is really, really educational, and I hope you'll get to learn from all that he shares. And I think this is really important when you get to look at it in this sense. Now, he critiques of the American's empire, which is grounded on historical, materialistic understanding of capitalism. Because for Richard Wolff, empires do not simply collapse because of foreign enemies. They implode from within their own internal structures, which becomes unsustainable. Remember, in his view, one of the most glaring symptoms of this decay is deliberate disinvestment in public education. And he argues that by getting education, the US is undercutting the very foundation of innovation, civic engagement, and economic resilience, which effectively digging its own grave. Buckle up for this video. I hope we all get to learn and understand his perspective. Just a simple plea. If you're watching us for the first time, I'm going to be asking you to subscribe to the channel, join the membership, and really get so I can offer you. But until then, let's dive right into the video. I'll be back with my commentary as usual.
Society. We want our kids to get college educations also. And you know who they turn to do that? The federal government. It stepped in to help finance all the state universities, but it was a federal and state partnership, as it has remained ever since. Today, three-quarters of our college students go to a public governmental institution. If you pull away the federal government's role, you leave it to the states, they're not going to be able to sustain it, and it means you're diminishing your commitment to education. Why in the world? What crazy logic would make you do that at this juncture in this country's history? It's because you don't want to spend the money. You already don't tax the super rich the way you once did. You do not tax corporations anything like what we did as recently as 30 and 40 years ago. You've given them the biggest tax breaks they ever got. So boasts Mr. Trump. So why, if you're not willing to tax them, do you add insult to the injury for the mass of people by destroying it and putting in charge of the education department a woman who's rich on the basis of wrestling? That's saying you don't care. You don't mind what happens. You don't want any agency of the government to be committed to adjusting and developing and improving education. It's not going to happen by itself, and it's not going to happen if you insult the entire educational community, teachers, students, parents, by this disrespectful slashing of a budget. It is a sign of a society disintegrating in terms of the institutions that ought to be helping it hold together. When the American empire and the American capitalist system was on the way up, we can start, as most people do about that, with the Civil War. It was at that period, the middle of the 19th century, that it was understood that in order to sustain the upward growth that everyone wanted to see, especially when the Civil War was over, you needed to educate people. So we had a big fight in the United States to create the public school system, right? That's what we did. And conservatives were against it. But everybody else, including the mass of working people, saw it as a way forward for the country, for the economy, and for themselves and their children. So we fought and we got, over opposition, a public school system. Then, as I mentioned earlier, we fought after the Second World War to give the mass of the working class college educations. And since they were unaffordable in the private schools, we had to create the state university and the state college and the community college systems. That is where most college students now get the overwhelming majority of Americans get their education. The government was crucial in these two breakthroughs. So what in the world do you conclude that we're now at a point where we're not expanding educational opportunities, expanding our commitment to education, which served us so well for the last century and a half? We're cutting it? We're getting rid of it? What? What kind of social nutsiness are we talking about here? This is not consistent with our own experience. And then when we come to the college student debt of our students, that was a horrific thing. You know, back after the Russians beat us to space, back in the 1950s with Sputnik, the original man in space, and the Russians did it first, it led to an immense conversation in the United States. And the 50s and 60s were times of rapid economic growth of the American economy. Much better, much more rapid than now. What was decided was we had made a mistake. We hadn't emphasized education. And we passed something called the National Defense Education Act, which created a vast army, you guessed it, of scholarships and fellowships to help students afford higher education. And it was understood to subsidize universities opening their doors to a whole new generation of young people who could now afford, with the help of these fellowships, to get an education and do their part to contribute to the economy. You're not doing that now. You're doing the reverse. Instead of giving the students money, you're sucking money out of them because of these loans that they have to spend the rest of their life paying off. In most European countries, especially accepting England with all that implies about that other empire's collapse, they don't do that. They don't charge tuition in French, German, and many other Europeans. You don't need to borrow money because there's free education. You know why they do that? Because they're Europeans? No. Because they don't speak English? Not it either. It's because they see an educated workforce as something the society wants to invest in, something the society sees as a good investment because it pays back in the enhanced creativity and the enhanced productivity of those people. Now, yeah, we could imagine that we are the smart ones who know that dismantling higher education, hobbling students with absurd debts, and then hanging them up for the rest of their life, paying the debts off, is some kind of master stroke that these poor Europeans haven't figured out how to do. But if you think like that, you need help. Not the help I can give you, but the help of people who could show you that you've misunderstood how the system works. And you're now in the grip of a political movement that thinks it's clever and smart to be backward economically, backward educationally, because that's all that's happening. You could draw a line as the decline of support for education in the last half century is also the decline of the American economy and the American political power. You should be real nervous about how those things are coordinated because they suggest what you're doing now is going to make matters worse. It's a little bit like watching the tariffs. All the tariffs are doing is teaching every corporation and every country in the world doing business with the United States is super risky, way more risky than you thought it was. Because whatever might happen to the taste for whatever you produce, whatever might happen to competition, it's possible in that country to have a president who gets away with changing the terms of your life, your business, at the drop of a hat, changing them tomorrow, rechanging them day after. The United States is becoming a rogue nation, not in the words, you won't get it, the leaders don't have the courage, but in the reality below the level of the government, of public relations. In every boardroom, they're sitting there trying to figure out, how do we reduce our vulnerability to a society that's falling apart? We used to get the brilliant minds, Brian, you mentioned them, here in the United States, but the brilliant minds around the world who wanted the best education they could get. So they brought their children, particularly the clever ones, to American schools and American universities and colleges. And of course, many of them became used to this country, became used to living here, and stayed here. You all know what I'm talking about because the doctor you see and the specialist you had referred to are people that are very clearly not what we are used to here in the United States. All of that is now reversing. They're not coming here. is too dangerous. They don't want an ICE person to jump on them, and they don't want to go where it looks like they're dismantling their education system. And worst of all, seem proud that they're doing it.
Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. Well, I'm hoping that you're doing great from wherever you're watching me from. Again, I'm your host and presenter, Stories. Welcome. I want us to talk about how education is really important in any empire, right? It plays a vital role in making people be innovative. All these things that are happening, glaring, glowing, that you're seeing is because of education. It is from education that we have technology. Now get to understand, historically, empires have thrived when they invested in knowledge and infrastructure. From the Islamic Golden Age to the British Empire, intellectual capital was central to imperial dominance. In the 20th century, America's rise as global superpower was tied to its massive public investment in education. The GI Bill, land grant universities, and funding of scientific research. These created a skilled workforce and a robust media class. Wolf argues that this strategic strength is now being systematically dismantled through privatization, budget cuts, and the commodification of knowledge. And this all happens as a result of the United States getting education. Also, talking about the neoliberal assault on public education, Wolf locates the decline in education within the broader framework of neoliberalism, which emerged in the 1970s and 1980s. Under this ideology, public services are seen as inefficient and subject to market discipline. Education, once regarded as a public good, has been turned into a commodity, with schools and universities run like businesses. This has led to skyrocketing tuition, student debt crisis, cuts to liberal and arts and critical thinking programs, and the rise of standardized testing over critical pedagogy. Wolf warns that this market-driven approach is hollow out the intellectual core of the nation. So this is all that happens. The neoliberal assault in public education is one of the things that is driving the United States down. And so this is a fight against the education. Intellectualism is something which is being fought in the United States. Being overly capitalistic, materialistic, the people teaching you need to get money, leave alone education. That's what the United States is trying to drive. I'm also going to be talking about a workforce ill prepared for the future. By underfunding education, the US is also failing to prepare its workforce for rapidly changing global economy. Wolf highlights how other countries, especially in Asia and parts of Europe, are investing heavily in STEM education, apprenticeships, and free or low-cost higher education. And in contrast, the US is producing generations burdened by debt, underserved by failing public education schools, and underprepared for complex challenges like climate change, AI, and geopolitical instability. These erodes America's competitiveness, forcing it to rely more on coercion, military and economic, than cooperation and innovation, right? Also, we're going to be talking about the role of empire in education prioritization. Wolf argues that the empire prioritizes military dominance over education because its strategy hinges on global control rather than domestic prosperity. The Pentagon receives over $800 billion annually, when public schools struggle with crumbling buildings, underpaid teachers, and lack of basic supplies. The logic is imperial. Control the world through force, not through intellectual leadership. But Wolf insists that this is a short-sighted approach. An empire that neglects the mind of its own people cannot sustain itself. Eventually, internal rot eclipses external power, and that's how it happens. Also, I'm going to be talking about the debt trap as a social control. One of Wolf's strongest critiques is aimed at the student debt crisis. which he sees as a form of economic control. In his view, saddling young people with tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt keeps them from challenging the system. They are less likely to protest, unionize, or pursue revolutionary careers because they are trapped in a cycle of repayment. Debt becomes a weapon of silence. This is not only suppress dissent, but stifles creativity and social mobility, hallmarks of a vibrant and evolving society. That's how it happens, right? Um, Also, talking about undermining democratic citizenship. For Wolf, education is not just about job training, it is about forming citizens capable of critical thought, participation, and resistance. By getting education, the US is creating a population that is easy to manipulate through propaganda, disinformation, and fear. Civic education has disappeared from many curricula, and neoliberal curricula discourage questioning the status quo. The result is an electorate susceptible to authoritarianism, xenophobia, and conspiracy theory. In Wolf's view, the dumping down of America is not accidental, it is functional for a crumbling empire. Also, talk about privatization and the rise of education inequality. This is something that is also happening, that is getting education. The shift from public to private education has also deepened inequality, a point Wolf frequently emphasizes. The elite institutions become the gatekeepers of opportunities, while the majority languish in underfunded school. Charter schools and voucher programs divert funds from public systems to corporate ventures. Meanwhile, corporate interests influence curricula, pushing pro-capitalist narratives while marginalizing labor history and anti-colonial studies. Economic alternatives. This bifurcation in education reproduces a two-tier society, one fit to rule and other fit to obey. Also, talk about brain drain and the crisis of intellectual capital. Another consequence of Wolf's identify is brain drain, the loss of intellectual talent either to private corporation or to foreign nation. Talented American students leave academia for tech firms or Wall Street, where profit motives override public interest. Others seek education and work opportunities in countries that value intellectual labor more highly. As the US devalues education, it undermines its own capacity to produce scholars, scientists, artists, and leaders capable of steering the nation through crisis. An empire without thinkers is an empire destined to fail. There is an historical parallel: Rome, Britain, and beyond. Wolf draws parallels between the US and historical empires like Rome and Britain. Each declined not simply from external invasion, but from internal neglect, specifically of the welfare and education of their own citizens. Rome's elite retreated into luxury while the masses suffered. Britain overextended military while neglecting domestic industries and education. Similarly, Wolf warns America is overextended abroad and undernourished at home. The lessons of history are clear. Empires die when they forget how to care for their own. Um, this is a call for urgent reinvestment. For Wolf, the solution is straightforward but politically difficult. Massive reinvestment in free, universal, and critical public education. This will mean not only repairing schools and eliminating student debt, but also transforming the curricula to include labor history, economics, philosophy, and democratic theory. It will also mean paying teachers dignified salaries and elevating education to national priorities it deserves. Only by educating its people can the US renew its democratic spirit and avoid the terminal decline of imperial decay. Right? I would like to end by saying that Richard Dewell's warning is both sobering and hopeful. sobering because it highlights the dangerous path America is currently on, choosing militarism and profit over intellectual developments of its people. Hopefully, because the trend is reversible, education, unlike natural resources, can be rebuilt. It is renewable foundation for democracy, equity, and resilience. But time is short, as whole facades. Every empire has its moment of reckoning. The question is whether America will wake up and invest in its people or continue to dig its own grave without the shovel of neglect. Otherwise, I'm your host and presenter Agent Stories. I'm hoping to see you in my next video. But until then, peace, love, and harmony. Salute.